Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here for my Friday reads, and I have had an extremely productive reading week and an extremely productive start to my reading in 2021. So last weekend I spent all of Friday, Saturday, Sunday just reading. Nothing else but reading apart from a few walks here and there, and it was very enjoyable and something I think I'm going to repeat this weekend. But I did manage last weekend to finish working my way through the Student Diaries of Simone de Beauvoir. I'm not going to talk any more about de Beauvoir's diaries in this video, as I think I spent 10-15 minutes in last week's Friday reads just talking about de Beauvoir's diaries, and I'm sure you've heard plenty about her on my channel here and are looking to hear something new, looking to hear what else I'm reading. And the answer is I'm reading a little bit more here. And so I started over the weekend this book by Sarah Lonsdale titled Rebel Women Between the Wars, Fearless Writers and Adventurers. And I purchased it a little bit on a whim, but with some intention in mind, with a Chapters Indigo gift card I got for Christmas. And it purports itself to be a biography, or a series of biographies, a collection of short biographies of feminist women who were sort of championing women's rights through the way they lived their lives between the First and Second World War. And the author specifically says that she's not looking at, prominent figures that we would recognize. She's not looking at the Virginia Woolfs of the world. Rather, she's looking at people who lived prominent and exciting lives, but perhaps aren't known to us. And so I did read the first chapter on Sunday, and it looks at several women who worked in journalism. So the UK editor of Vogue, and I think there were 4 women in particular. So Rose Macaulay, who I had never heard of, who was a poet and a novelist. Naomi Rhodes-Smith, who was also a novelist and who was apparently the literary editor at 2 publications, one called the Saturday Westminster and one called the Queen, and also Alison Settle and Edith Shackleton. And Edith Shackleton interests me the most, as she was the first female parliamentary correspondent in the United Kingdom. And so it does appear to be chock full of these little short biographical snippets about women that I perhaps wouldn't have heard of. And she's looking at writers. I think later on she's going to look at women in other career paths. But although I am enjoying the biographical snippets, it is kind of a clumsily written book. It's very academic, and it's almost like a badly formed essay, if that makes sense. Like, she's trying to make some arguments about how women were advancing the feminist cause between the First and the Second World War in Europe, and most particularly it seems to be in the United Kingdom. But she doesn't do it well, and I almost wish that she had sort of stepped back from trying to make broad sweeping statements about how women were trying to advance that feminist cause after they won the vote, and rather had just focused on telling us about these very interesting women. But I will continue on despite the clumsy writing style. And then I decided to pull a book off my shelf that has been sitting on my shelf for a couple of years. And it was because when I was reading the Student Diaries of Simone de Beauvoir, and she mentioned during her philosophy studies reading Nietzsche, that I decided to finally pull down the Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And I have read a little bit of Nietzsche in my own studies, and it was snippets here and there between the political theory courses I was taking, where he was, absolutely held up as someone to be avoided, as someone whose ideas were bad, as someone whose ideas would lead to, the ruin of civilization and were bad for governance. And I also studied him a little bit in a philosophy class I took, where I think he was looked at more in an objective manner. The philosophy class was very much about exploring the ideas, whereas when you study philosophers in political theory classes, there's a lot more sort of ethical and moral judgments thrown in. And it's not what I expected at all. I expected Nietzsche to be difficult to understand. I expected him to be almost obtuse, but this is a very accessible text. And from the introductory notes and whatnot in the beginning, it does appear that it is the book by Nietzsche that people go to the most because it is one of his most accessible. And I think it's described as, one of the most consumable as well, because it is in a novel format. And despite sitting on my shelf for almost 3 years, I didn't in fact realize that it was in a novel format. And I'm taking the approach to it as someone reading a novel, but I'm going, slowly in bits and pieces, reading a few pages, a section at a time, just so I can process what he's doing. And it is quite fun to read because you do see those, that almost biblical style to it, the style of, Jesus in the Bible telling parables. And it's intellectually stimulating. I don't know how I feel about the ideas in it yet. I'm certainly not someone who's going to embrace Nietzsche, but there are some interesting ideas emerging throughout. I'm about 50 pages in. Last night I had read the section titled "On the Flies of the Marketplace," and the section itself was such a stimulating picture in the mind that I felt the need to go onto YouTube and see if anyone had sort of recorded a reading of it, and several people have, and I quite enjoyed listening to that. It really puts vivid images in your mind, and I'm looking forward to continuing to dig my way through this. I did read the introduction ahead of time, which I think this is one case where you would want to read those introductory notes. Often I skip them, especially in the Oxford World Classics and in the Penguin editions, because there are lots of spoilers. But this is perhaps an instance when you would want those spoilers, because in the introduction, I think it's by Graham Parks, because that's the translator. I would guess he probably wrote the introduction as well. I should have checked. I just read the introduction and went on my merry way. Yeah, I'm going to guess the introduction is by the translator as well. Yep, there we go, Graham Parks. But Parks does a little bit of very useful analysis of some of the terms that are going to appear in this and the particular translations that he chose. So in this translation, he uses the terminology of the overhuman, and I was a little bit stumped by that because I hadn't come across that in my previous studies of Nietzsche, because I was used to the idea of the Superman or the superhuman, because that's what we used in my political theory classes, where my professor absolutely vilified him. But yeah, there are certain terminology that comes up that it's useful to have a little bit of background information on. And it's also useful to have some of the context in which he wrote this. So when Nietzsche was writing, I guess there was a real interest and a resurgence in Zoroastrianism. And I didn't make the connection from Zarathustra to Zoroastrianism, but I guess Zarathustra is one of the names used to identify the founder of that religion, and so he's sort of pulling from that and also from Luther's translation of the Bible. So you've got, Lutheranism emerging in Germany, and I definitely feel that influence on the text here. But anyway, enjoying reading my way through this. I'm going to continue to go through slowly, probably take over the course of a couple of weeks to read this. I've been reading Balzac, and I'm about 100 pages in to Letters of Two Brides, and this is by far the best work in Volume 1. It's an epistolary novel told through letters. And so we have the letters of Louise, the letters of Renee, and the letters of Louise's lover, who is a Spanish duke who has lost his title and has taken refuge in France. But we get these very intimate letters between Louise and Renee, two young women who met at the convent where they were sent. And it was expected from Louise's aristocratic family that she was going to choose the life of the convent. She was sent there as a young girl around the time that her grandmother died. And her father had thought he had solved all his problems by carting his daughter off to the convent. She was going to be a nun. She was going to spend her life there. She wouldn't marry. There'd be no need for her to draw on her dowry or on the fortune that was left to her, and her father was going to give it to his second-born son to make him independent as well. But she threw a wrench in his plans by coming back from the convent. You give the family some credit there because they didn't try to force her to stay in that convent. They let her come back, and she has her sort of grand entrance into society. And she has these romantic ideals about what life would be, what life should be, and what love should be, and what a romantic affair should be. But she's very disappointed at the start when she has got on all her fine clothes and she takes a ride in the carriage, and the gentlemen in the streets don't stop to stare at her in admiration. She realizes that pretty women are a dime a dozen in Paris. And although she's enjoying the social atmosphere, her launch into society, and the odd sort of quirks that happen with people's behavior in society, she is still looking for this grand love affair, and she ends up with a Spanish tutor because her father has been given a diplomatic position in Spain, and her father has asked her to accompany him to Spain. And so she's learning Spanish, and in walks this sort of fallen duke who she is first, a little bit wary of. She's just flirting with him. She doesn't know who she is, and then of course she realizes that he is someone of some position, and is in fact still has the title of a baron, and has land somewhere outside of Spain where he can still go to his big estate and live. And she's sort of got her eye on that, and she begins this flirtation with him, this very romanticized version. She compares them to Romeo and Juliet, or I'm not sure whether she does or she makes a reference to it, but certainly Balzac does, because she is making a signal to him that they've agreed upon at the opera, and the opera is Romeo and Juliet. And there is this very dramatic scene where she notices him hiding in a tree outside of her window, which is a nod to the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. But so you've got Louise in Paris living this very society life, and I expect in the next few pages she's going to marry her lover and experience life when you marry for love and when you're in society. But on the other hand, we have her friend Renee, who is also at the convent, who also left the convent, but went back to her parents' provincial estate in the French provinces, and she ends up marrying a man about 20 years older than her who has this very romanticized story, but he's a very broken man. He went off as a young man to fight with Napoleon against the Russians, and he ended up being taken prisoner and sent to a Siberian prison camp somewhere. And it was only after many years, after everyone in the community, except for his father, believed that he was dead, that he came back, injured and just mentally fatigued. A young man who is aged beyond his years. And he's come back. His father has been sort of miserly saving money for the day when his prodigal son returns. He's come back and he wants his son to marry someone with title. And so Renee finds herself in this arranged marriage, and she takes on this very duty-bound and philosophical outlook and writes to Louise about how she's going to have a great life. Her life is going to be her children, and that in marriage, love is something that you work for. And Louise is very critical of her choices, but I am greatly enjoying this novel. And I think because it's told through letters, Balzac is able to do in this novel something that I haven't seen him do in any other work I've read by him. He is able to create this sort of intimate character, these intimate characters and this intimate look into their minds. And we really see society through their eyes in a very personal way that I greatly am enjoying. Yesterday, I finished reading Harold Bloom's How to Read. I had this on my shelf for a little while, finally picked it up. And I guess I enjoyed it. Calling it How to Read and Why is a little bit of false advertising. There are some tidbits, read this author because there is an introduction that says, we should read because it helps us to know ourselves. But for the most part, it's just little essays on some of his favorite authors and why he feels they're valuable and why he feels they are worth reading. And so he has a section first on short stories, a section on poetry, 2 sections on the novel, and a section on plays. I did appreciate his analysis of short stories, where he describes most modern short stories as coming from 2 different schools of thought, 2 different heritages. You have the novels that emerge after Chekhov, and you have the novels that emerge after Borges. The Borges is more imaginative. The Borges is less out of touch with reality. It's almost like you go down the rabbit hole and there's a little twist. The Chekhov is a little more based in reality. At least that's how I understood his distinction there. I enjoyed his talk about poetry as well, and especially his little section on why to read Proust, why to read Henry James. And I think this is something that I'll keep on my shelf and maybe refer to now and then, if I read some more of the authors that he mentions in here. Very American-centric, as you would expect from an American author and an American literary critic, but overall an interesting read. Now here is the massive book on my agenda. I am going to be reading this with fellow booktuber Hannah, and I'll be sure to link to her channel down below. But I saw this on her Instagram a couple of days ago. I think it was Monday or Tuesday. So literally just a couple of days ago. And I was like, oh, I've seen that cover. I eyed this when I think it came out in paperback, or maybe it was the hardcover. I saw this physically in the bookstore a year or 2 ago, and I was very close to buying it, but did not, just because the sheer massiveness of it, and it's quite an investment. Just to give you a little look into what this would cost. My copy here has the price of $39.95 in the cover, and I'm pretty sure that's the American price, because if you were to buy this in Canadian dollars, it would be quite a bit more, because I remember it being, I think it might have been $59.95 when I saw it, or upwards of $50. And I actually did end up paying about that just to get myself this used copy. But it was a lot better to order it from a used bookshop here in Ontario, a shop by the name of Minnow Tavaros Books in Whitby, Ontario, than it was to order it new. Amazon said ships in 1 to 2 months, and Chapter said the same thing, and it was going to cost me about the same. And so I went the used route with the expectation that it would arrive in a day or two, and they processed my order on Tuesday. It arrived on Thursday, and so that is, excellent domestic shipping. And I specifically looked for a shop in Canada, knowing that if I ordered it from the UK, as I often do, it would probably take 2 to 3 weeks. And if I ordered it from the United States, it could be stuck in Mississauga hell for a long time. Oddly enough, things sometimes take longer to ship out of the States than they do out of the United Kingdom. And when I order from countries in Europe, I tend to get what I expect. They send them and they arrive by Canada Post, and there's no extra fees. Whereas when I've been ordering from shops in the United States, I sometimes run into what I feel is the rather dishonest problem of booksellers choosing to send things by private courier companies. And there is a couple of courier companies that I've had bookshops, without telling me, send stuff through, that they sort of have an agreement with customs where there's an extra fee to get things through customs quicker, which is not what I want, because it ends up showing up and it's like $10 or $11 extra, which isn't a lot, but when it's not what I agreed to on top of shipping, I don't want books to be showing up at my local post office through COD, which is collect on delivery, because that just seems dishonest to me, to send something by a private courier that's going to charge me extra when it arrives without actually telling me, because that's not a typical custom fee. That's not duty or whatever. That's the fee from the private courier company. And I never ever run into that problem when ordering from Europe. And so that's why I tend to avoid ordering books from the United States if I can. There are a couple shops that I trust, because they do indeed send things by United States Postal Service, which then gets over into Canada Post and things arrive okay. But sorry, I just got off on a tangent there. The novel, A Biography by Michael Schmidt, I saw this on Hannah's Instagram, and I think I replied with a comment with an exclamation point with, I want to read that one. And she said, well, how about a buddy read? And so we're going to buddy read this one over the course of 2021. She had set for herself a schedule where she was going to read 1 chapter a week, and so we're going to adhere to her schedule. And I have read the prologue and introduction to catch up with her. I'm not going to talk about that now. Maybe I'll save that for next week, as we're getting a little bit long here. We're almost at 25 minutes. But we're going to read a chapter a week, and there's somewhere between 40 and 45 chapters in here. So it'll keep us busy and going for the majority of the weeks of 2021. And I am greatly looking forward to this. I'm glad that Hannah gave me an excuse to finally shell out the money and buy it and to read it. And it is shaping up, from the introduction that I've read so far, to be quite an interesting book. So I will leave it at that. If you've read any of these books, be sure to let me know in the comments below what you thought of them, and I hope you have an excellent weekend.